And the catalogs do a great job of saying, this is an amazing plant, you should buy it, right? That's their job. But your job is to take those plants and say, do they fit in this landscape? Do they fit with my lifestyle? My favorite thing actually is tapping the trees and just drinking the sap itself. I think that so fundamental to humanity's challenge right now is a disconnect from nature. Build relationships with trees, with plants, just like you would with another human.
Hey, welcome for another episode at the Food Forest podcast. Today I have a special guest. His name is Steve Gabriel and he wrote a fantastic book called Farming the Woods. Sometimes if you start with a food forest from like a prairie or a bare piece of land, you have to start from zero. But what if you inherit a forest and you want to start farming that forest? Well, then I always recommend the book Farming the Woods from Steve Gabriel. Steve, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing?
Thanks, it's lovely to be with you here.
Fantastic. You are the co-owner of Wellspring Forest Farm and School in Mecklenburg, New York, in the Finger Lakes region. Tell me, what are you doing there?
Sure. Yeah, we have about 20 acres that we're stewarding here, and we're doing a whole ton of stuff. I mean, it's about half forested and it's about half open pasture, at least it was when we started. Now it's almost all forested. So we've been planting trees since we got here about 14 years ago. And it's really lovely to see every year. It's a little bit different, a little more lush, a little more shady, which we like and our sheep like. We graze sheep through the system, both in the pasture and some of the woodland areas. We've had all sorts of poultry. We've had ducks and geese and things like that. We currently just have some chickens that we raised mostly for like our own family needs. We produce maple syrup from the existing maple woods that's on the site. Yeah, best time of the year, every year. It's when my son was born too, in March.
Cool.
We produce mushrooms in the woods as well as indoors. We have an indoor grow facility as well to extend the season and balance out some of the inevitable unknowns with forest farming, which we can talk about more. And then we're doing a whole bunch of research. So we have a tree nursery. We're researching willow as a very interesting agroforestry species, mulberry, black locust. So just trying to really hone in and learn specific trees and what they can offer to the farm, and offer to other farms. We're really interested in demonstrating and practicing things that we feel like others can adopt as well.
In a moment, we're gonna delve deeper into farming the woods and how one can start to farm the woods or create woods to farm. But first, I'm always super curious to hear what brought you to the subject. Was it like known for you since you were 15, 16 years old? You wanted to go in that direction, or did you had an interesting path leading you there?
Yeah, for me, it was a love for the woods that was cultivated in my childhood, encouraged by the beauty of the landscape of where I grew up, which is this area, and just furthered by time spent in various places, the Pacific Northwest and Oregon, and the majestic kind of old growth that's there, and learning to forage mushrooms there, and just having this wonder and awe of that place. The redwoods in California, of course. I spent a semester of college in northern Scotland at the Findhorn Eco Village.
Oh, lovely.
And that really introduced me to permaculture and introduced me to people who were thinking about just the positive way that people can interact with the environment. A lot of the rhetoric I had learned, and maybe it's more US centric, is sort of like, well, if humans are involved, all we're going to do is trash the woods, is extract from it, is do bad things. And when I was in Scotland, that was the first time I'd seen humans really thinking about a positive way, and actually maybe even a necessary way that people can play a role in ecological health. And so when I moved back to the US and I learned some more permaculture and started teaching classes and really thought it was a great modality to encourage that kind of thinking. That led to agroforestry at some point. And so it's just been this path of finding these named things that describe ultimately a love for the forest and also a desire to be in partnership with it, not just take what I need and try to be productive and produce and sell and all those kind of things, but that being a component of really a relationship between hopefully people and the natural world that benefits everybody at the same time.
How long have you spent the time in Findhorn?
I was just there for like 8 or 9 months in total. Yeah.
Wow, must have been amazing. At the beginning of my journey, I read this little book about Findhorn, about the older guy who's now passed away, who co-founded the place, and it was like crazy, almost like magical what he did and what the people there did. Did you feel that almost magical, I don't know, energy hanging around there or that they created? How would you describe that?
I definitely felt it's a very sacred feeling place, and the people it attracts have their own sort of layers. So it was very, for being in far northern Scotland, it was quite diverse internationally. There were a lot of people from all over the world. So that brought a certain energy to it. But there's definitely all of this, I bring sort of a spiritual connection to the woods and to a relationship to things. And it certainly was sparked there and very present there in everything we did. Yeah.
Do they have a food forest over there?
They had some things going on. They had some perennials. There were patches throughout. I don't remember in particular like something they said this is the food forest, but certainly again these dwellings and the way they were laying things out, you'd walk by a currant bush or you'd see the fruit tree and it would sort of be just part of the landscape, and that I think it was one of the first places I'd experienced that really, where it wasn't even like this is a farm and this is not. It was really just
So
here we live and here other things live. And my greatest joy right now is my kids are almost 3 and 5, and they walk out of the door at our house and they go eat fruit off the bushes, and they think that's a normal way to be raised, right? And it took me more than half my life to even experience that, right? So
wow.
I think that is the greatest sense of what needs to happen with a lot of this is bringing that to be a normal experience, especially for the next generation.
You're giving them a head start. Well, what a wonderful journey you had, and I have to admit I'm a bit jealous of you spending 9 months in Findhorn. It's really on my bucket list to go there, but yeah, life is
And
still
there's a
long.
really special island, the Isle of Airade, which is further north. It's a sister community. That's really where I felt like I hit the kind of peak of my experience there. And they do immersions there. I imagine they're still doing them.
Oh, what's the name? Isle of.
Arid, Erraid, I believe. It's an island up in the Northern Highlands that we got
Ooh,
to spend like 10 days at. That was really, really quite transformative.
wow. Interesting. Well, like this information for our listener, we're gonna put it in our show notes so people can easily find the links to it. Yeah, Findhorn, really read the book if you listener haven't heard about Findhorn yet. It's like a totally different way of looking at co-creating with nature. So one of the things that people find difficulty with and wrapping their head around is that you buy a forest or you inherit the forest or you can just work in a forest. How do you transform like an existing forest to a food forest in the most respectful way? To give you an example, here in Belgium, where I'm located at this moment, you simply cannot do that. It's illegal to even touch a forest and make it edible. But imagine that it would be legal, or you're living in a place where it is possible. What are like the first things to do?
First thing is certainly very long and thoughtful observation and really a lot of questioning. So who's here? Who's growing here now? What are the site conditions? Are these plants and trees thriving? Are they struggling? Is it a healthy, diverse ecosystem, or is it something that's, in the US, we have a lot of abandoned pastures and abandoned farmland that have sort of reverted to a mix of lots of thick, shrubby, thorny, sort of often called invasive species. I don't prefer that word, but things sort of taking over, right? Not as effectively as humans did, but sort of marginally, often like what we think of as like a marginal woods versus something that is much healthier. And when we look at like successional forests, if it's to me in agroforestry, I always say if it's a healthy forest and it has a healthy trajectory, meaning in at least in my part of the world, like 100, 200-year old, like the trees can live that long. There's a clear set of species that will live that long and that'll be part of that forest. Well, then our goal is to really just help it continue on. We need all those healthy older forests to do what they're doing. Where we can do a lot more intervention, when I think about where we graze our sheep, where we put silvopasture into play, or where we do forest farming, or where we plant a more diversity, sort of a wider range of edible shrubs and trees, things like that. Those would be where I think the edge spaces, the marginal spaces, the less healthy woods, so to speak, where the birds, the wildlife, the pollinators actually aren't benefiting from what's there and what's sort of, again, like often in our case, like this thicket of vegetation. It's actually not offering that much. Or in our open pastures, which when we got here, we're just been hayed for forever, right? there's no bird perches. There's no flowering trees at different times of the year. It's ecologically, if you keep mowing it all the time, it's really not very diverse at all. So we try to leave parts of our pasture growing long and tall because grassland habitat is just as important as other habitats. And we've now planted so many trees. There's so much three-dimensional edge. There's things flowering every single, month or week of the growing season where it might just be a small window. So right now the basswoods are flowering, which is a tree that is really highly valued for the honey that it produces. And a few weeks ago we had our black locust flowering, which was almost overwhelming how much aroma filled the air. Absolutely lovely for the pollinators and the bees, right? So we just look for spaces, and the question to me until I start is, can I increase health? Can I increase diversity? Am I engaged in something that's restorative? So many of our ecological landscapes have been degenerated. Can we be regenerative? Or is this already relatively healthy? Can I just kind of help it move in a direction it's already headed, if that makes sense? It already
So
has ecological health and diversity. Let me just continue to nudge it along versus maybe make a heavier intervention in other places.
yeah, so you're never going to like make food production the most important part if you see that a forest is already on its trajectory to become like the climax vegetation it is supposed to be. You're not going to interfere in that. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, it's all going to be context specific and like what land people have access to and all those kind of things. But for instance, most of our forest is not what we consider sort of on a healthy trajectory. But the one part that is a few acres of the sugar maples that make maple syrup. So we luck out because continuing those trees on their trajectory is also a food producing system. But no, I mean, I think if, there's other parts of the woods, for instance, that are starting to emerge as like a hickory forest, right? So there's food production in there. It may not be as intensive as if I cleared those trees and planted dense hazelnuts. It's not necessarily going to produce as much food, or it might be harder to actually harvest and process for my own use, but boy, it benefits a lot of the wildlife. And it's sort of what wants to be there. And it's much easier to support the natural succession that's already showing up than it is to like erase everything and try to build it from scratch. So I just always encourage people to consider balancing what they imagine as possible with what's already sort of showing up from the natural system, and how you can, I think there's always a natural intersection in all the clients and consulting projects I've worked on. Like, we just have to land to that place where it actually fits, where the people's goals and the landscape, what the land is telling us, kind of match. And there's always that intersection, and that's what we end up recommending as far as like how you go about building these different,
Yeah,
systems.
to check where is the nature going, where does the human wants to go, and then see where it interacts. But let's imagine you inherit a 100 or 200-year-old beech oak forest,
Right.
which is already like super dense with a lot of shadow.
Hmm.
What, for example, could you grow there? Okay, you can eat the acorns, you can eat the
Right.
beech nuts,
Yeah.
but other than that, what things would you recommend to do if you inherit such a forest?
Yeah, I mean, that'd be lovely. I had hoped when we got land that it was going to have older forest, and we didn't end up there. But, usually those forests, if they're relatively healthy, can always use some additional thinning. And my forestry mentor always said, you just thin as Mother Nature would thin. So the way forests evolve is they naturally kind of overplant, they overstock, and then they thin themselves out. And the way thinning happens is one tree will shade out the other, or one tree has more genetic resistance to a fungal disease while the other, even if it's the same species, doesn't. And eventually the forest thins it out. So if we look at like an acre of woods, you might have hundreds of thousands of seeds, tens of thousands of trees growing on that site over the course of many decades, but the ultimate forest, a dense canopy, is only like 100 trees per acre. It's a very small amount. So Mother Nature naturally like way overplants and then thins to find sort of the best options for the space. And that could just be one species, or it could be multiple ones. And so when we do forestry, we look at, again, what's going on there and how can we maybe move it along a bit faster. So we notice trees that are already suppressed, are already in the understory of the canopy. There's trees that are clearly growing faster and stronger and more disease resistant. Okay, well, we can thin those smaller diameter trees, or those more suppressed trees. And my favorite go-to for that, and what I did a lot of research in, was mushroom cultivation. And you
Okay.
say, beech and oak, well, those are both perfect species for shiitake mushrooms. And that's one of the oldest forest farmed crops in the world. We have records, several thousand years old, dating back to parts of China, Korea, and Japan.
Wow.
of folks harvesting trees and inoculating them with shiitake mushrooms. So
And how did they do that 1,000 years ago? They cut down the beech or the oak tree, and how did they inoculate them? You know?
it seems like mostly it's not well documented, but probably mostly what they happened was they would find a log that was clearly fruiting those mushrooms naturally, and they would cut, even just with a hatchet or something like that, into the sapwood, into the inner wood of that tree, and then they'd lay fresh wood on top. And the hope was that the mycelium would move from log to log. And that was replaced at some point where we started drilling holes in the logs and then actually culturing or growing out that mycelium and then actually like planting it into the logs. But a lot of that technology to sort of like collect and propagate really didn't happen for a very long time. It seems like it's relatively recent that we really developed that understanding. But yeah, so there's kind of this natural ability to create the conditions for things to spread. Fortunately, these days we have very clear recipes. We have suppliers that can give us mushroom spawn, and we can just drill some holes and inoculate.
So
We just
is
did a
it just
workshop.
as easy as that? Like, how would you explain a 12-year-old
Yeah,
to do that?
yeah. We just did a class, and I had a 12-year-old in it, so it's a perfect.
Perfect.
It's really about cutting fresh wood. So you don't want wood that's been cut or down on the forest floor for too long.
But it's too long. What's like the maximum?
I would say like no more than like 6 months of time.
Okay.
If you have a good solid cold winter, that can maybe be extended because during the winter there's not a lot of fungal activity. The main thing is that over time other fungus will move into the log and use it, and so it
Okay.
probably won't work for what you want. And then it's basically there's different methods for introducing the what we call spawn, which is the mycelium, usually in sawdust, into the inner part of the wood, specifically the sapwood, the first few inches. And so you could drill holes every so often. Like we'll drill our shiitake logs with holes maybe every 4 to 6 inches apart, and every 2 inches we'll do another row. And we just kind of dot the whole log with these holes, and then we'll plunge in the spawn. And then we'll cover it with usually like a hot wax to just seal it up.
And plunge in the spawn. How do you do that?
Either with a tool that's kind of like a little plunger, or you can buy little wooden dowels usually with the spawn and just hammer them into the wood that have been inoculated.
And those you can just buy online, right?
Yeah, they're getting more and more common to find for sure. You can make them yourself, but it's a bit more involved. It's sort of like learning to save seed versus just buying seed from a supplier. Usually people start, they buy seed or buy plants, and then
It's already
maybe
one thing
get
less that can go wrong.
Yeah, exactly. So get yourself on the right foot. You can also just cut, we do a lot of inoculation that we just cut stumps of trees, and we either cut like, 8 or 10 inch sort of sections off, and we'll just layer the spawn in between each piece. Or you can cut wedges and like pack the spawn in the tree and then put the wedge back and nail that back into place. So there's
Like
different ways.
with a tree that's still alive or that's already dead.
No, so it'd be one you cut down. So, instance, if I
Yeah.
cut a
Okay.
whole tree down and I left the stump tall, I could do that. Or
Okay.
I could just cut a piece of wood that's a bit bigger, stand it up on its end, and cut pieces and just introduce
Okay.
mycelium. We have some videos on our YouTube channel and such that we can connect folks to see that process.
All
It's
right.
relatively easy, and that one you don't need any specialized tools. If you're already cutting trees with a chainsaw, you just need the mushroom mycelium, and you can introduce this, into these spaces. So,
And
we'll
you say you use wax.
yeah.
What kind of wax do you use?
So usually, like a food grade, like a cheese wax, is usually good. It seals up the log. But we've been also experimenting with clay in some of the stumps, just something to seal off the mycelium from critters because it does attract bugs and insects and even like birds sometimes, things like that. So the wax is one way. We just did this class and tried to seal everything with like pottery clay essentially, and that worked quite well to kind of seal off any of the cracks. And it's most important for the first few months that mycelium is protected. It allows it time to just move into the wood. And once it's in the wood, these logs can last for anywhere from 3 years to some of ours have fruited for 7 or 8 years over time. Yeah.
Yeah. And is it important that this wood has a certain humidity? Do you like to have to put it in water or like have a kind of shock effect? Those are things I heard.
Yeah, the shiitake has, we kind of outline the whole process in the book. The shiitake has a particular set of circumstances. The good news about logs is that the moisture is held in the wood. It doesn't tend to lose moisture very easily. If you've ever made firewood, you're familiar with this. You actually have to like actively dry firewood. So if you keep a healthy log, the bark's intact and it's fresh. We
The
did some
humidity is
research.
still perfect.
Well, and you keep it in the woods. The most important thing is you don't put it out in a sunny, dry location. You keep it in the forest. The forest, it's amazing. One tree will cycle hundreds of gallons of water every day through its evapotranspiration, right? So the humidity in the forest is perfect. The light in the forest is perfect. If you keep them in there, they're going to have the right environment. You really don't have to do much other than wait. The logs take a little more time than like the blocks or something that we make in our indoor farm. So often we're waiting like 6 months to a year before things start fruiting. But like I say, they'll last for several years after that. So it's a really nice sort of perennial production
Yeah.
system. Yeah.
And what happens if you start out with a field and you don't have enough shade yet? Can you already grow mushrooms that way, like creating your own shade or other techniques?
Yeah, there's other ones that like grow in beds. And so actually for food forestry in particular, there's a mushroom called the wine cap stropharia. That mushroom is very easy to grow. You basically just sprinkle the spawn with wood chip mulch and can get it to form mycelial mats in your mulch and then fruit from there. And what's interesting about that is, with food forest in particular, you're often wanting to mulch your plants. These mushrooms love to grow amidst plants. I think the shade, the moisture is kind of a nice balance for them. So we've had very good success. And it's like what they're ultimately doing is actually decomposing this material. So they're helping cycle those nutrients, break it down, build soil. And it's just one more thing that you could find yielding out of that
Yeah.
space. So
So you
that's like,
basically just have to use mulch like you would use mulch otherwise, and then you just like put this spawn beneath that mulch, and then they will come automatically.
yeah, there's a little bit of a technique to incorporate maybe a little bit of compost or a little bit of sawdust, something like easier for it to digest early on, and then it can
Okay.
move into the wood chips. But we've had success with a lot of different types of inoculations. But yeah, that's one I'd recommend. Or there's other similar species that kind of work in beds. So you have your stumps, you have your logs, you have your beds, you have a lot of different options. And of course,
What
you
do you
could
mean with
inoculate.
beds?
Oh, just like a bed of wood chips or a bed of straw,
Okay.
just on the
All right.
ground versus in a.
Yeah. And I also heard that some people use like urine to grow wine caps. Is that true? Would that work?
I mean, they're probably getting the benefit of that additional nitrogen for sure. So it's to me, it's all part of a holistic strategy for managing healthy soil, right? Often what we're mostly starting with in many of these systems is a depleted soil, and so anything we can do to build up the diversity of the microbiology is helpful. So when you're adding urine, you're just putting a lot of nitrogen
Hmm.
into the space, and I'm sure the mushrooms both digest that and use it as a food source, because what mushrooms are doing is the mycelium is moving through that and then secreting enzymes and just digesting its food around it, and that's what creates the energy for the mushrooms to fruit. And so in the process of doing that, all they're doing is making soil. So what I
Hmm.
love about mushroom growing is I like to say, you're facilitating decomposition. You're just like adding to that mix of what will inevitably happen, but you're putting in things that also are really tasty to eat, or very, in some cases, like just medicinal, like really valuable. So another favorite mushroom I like to grow more and more is turkey tail, Trametes versicolor, which is one of the more diverse and widely available species in the temperate world. And it will eat almost any wood. So when people say, I have this species of wood, is there anything I can grow? That's always a good one to try. And it's a highly medicinal mushroom. It's not one you eat. It's kind of woody, but the extracts, whether it's tea or we make like a tincture out of it, has some amazing medicinal properties. And so that can be another way to bring, again, bring decomposition in, but also food and medicine.
Yeah. So you're basically eating a byproduct of soil regeneration, which is fantastic.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
mushrooms.
And so turkey tail grows in almost anything. Wine cap, do they, the Stropharia rugoso annulata, do they also grow on like any wood chips?
Most of these, yeah, they're pretty flexible. We did a research trial. We found when we use just pure pine chips that it had a harder time. The resins, I think, in
Hmm.
the wood that make
Yeah.
them very aromatic. So I wouldn't put them in like pure pine or cedar or sort of like a conifer species. I would try to find some deciduous tree, leafy tree. But other than that, they've been quite forgiving. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So mushrooms, it's a big part, and I think there are probably like dozens of more of mushrooms you can try. Um, Another thing is sap. So if you already have trees standing, you're already talking about maple syrup. Can you maybe, for people who don't know it, quickly guide us through how maple syrup is made? By the way, it's literally one of my favorite things on this planet, maple
Oh,
syrup. I
yeah.
love the taste so much.
Yeah, and probably even more relevant to a lot of listeners is my favorite thing is the syrup is wonderful, but my favorite thing actually is tapping the trees and just drinking the sap itself. And there are maple trees in many different climates around the world, and also trees like birch, sycamore. There's other trees that will produce sap. Walnuts will produce a sap, and so you can drink it like fresh, which is its own kind of unique experience. What we do is most of it we're collecting the sap during the time of year when the trees are coming out of dormancy. So they have produced extra sugar the previous year. Basically, we're in July of 25. So next year's sugar crop is being made now as they photosynthesize. Come August or so, they start to put more of that sugar down into their roots and they're storing that for next spring. And so when they start to break out of dormancy, which I mean, honestly, it's really become highly variable because of climate change. But it used to always be like end of February. Now it can be as early as January. Sometimes it can be later. Those trees will start to break out of dormancy. And so the sap is coming out of the roots and going up to the top of the tree. And it's very high flow and high pressure actually system because it's all locked up in the tree. So you just tap into the vein of that in a sense. The sap is running around the entire outside of the tree in the cambium layer. You're just tapping into one small portion of that. And typically a tree will produce uh, around a quart of syrup's worth of sap, like quite a bit of sap, sometimes 10, 20, 30 gallons of sap. But we have to boil that down because it's mostly water. It's usually coming out of the tree at about 2% sugar and finished syrup is about 67% sugar. So then we have to boil that water off to get it down to that.
I have to boil it for a long time. And so you say you have 1 quart, which is about a liter per tree of syrup. Like
That's
after you boiled it for
yeah.
hours.
Yes, that's a potential given a good year and all the right things happen. Yes.
So if you like buy a liter or a quart of maple syrup, that's like 1 tree.
Yeah,
That's
one tree for
incredible.
1 year. That's
Yeah, it's think about that next time you buy a bottle. Yeah, yeah. And
yeah.
so you're doing this with maple syrup. Could you also make it from birch sap or other saps? This kind of syrup?
Yeah, so birch is common. That tends to flow a little later than maples, but that's probably actually more common globally as a sap tree. It actually has even a higher ratio, so you usually have to boil even more, and it has a kind of like a more licorice type flavor, like more savory than sweet, but really quite nice. And then there's yeah, we've had folks around here and further south in the U.S. tap black walnut trees. So some walnut trees will produce a sap. Sap's not very good; it's kind of bitter, but the syrup's really it's like a nutty maple syrup, like almost like maple
Ooh,
syrup and honey and a little bit nutty flavor. So it's quite
oh my
nice.
God, I've never tried that. I'm addicted to walnut oil, so I'm probably
Yeah,
gonna love the walnut sap. So
yeah,
I'm gonna have to check for the right varieties to grow in yeah, different climates because
definitely.
maple syrup can only be tapped in if you have a certain winter, right? If you have like a minimum temperature.
We can tap them most years. What we see is the volume and the sugar content is highly variable depending on what happened the previous summer, but also how it thaws out. And the biggest challenge with climate change really is so when sap comes out of a tree, it's almost like milk. It's very it's very shelf. It's sort of very vulnerable to spoilage. And so when I started sugaring like 20 years ago, nature was a refrigerator, so the sap could sit in a tank for days and be fine. But now you could have a sap flow and then it could get to 65 degrees the next day and ruin everything. And so you really have to be careful to boil it down and get it safe, quicker now because we just don't have that same stability. And so there's a lot of variability that comes into how much sap, how much sugar is in it, and how long you can store it. That makes it much more challenging to do these days.
Yeah, yeah, otherwise you almost have to devise a system where it flows into a refrigerator.
And a lot of farms around here that are larger producers they'll often use old dairy equipment, which you have a milk tank that basically circulates and keeps it cool. They'll actually use that now for maple. Yeah.
Gosh, crazy.
Yeah.
So I always heard that if you go more north, for example, New York, Vermont, which I've been and I've tasted several maple syrups, they're all fantastic there. There, the maple syrup is better than if you would go more south.
Right.
Is that true? Is that a myth? Does it has to do something with
Yeah.
temperatures?
Everybody says theirs is the best is the reason. So you just didn't go far enough south and ask those people. So the bedrock, the actual soil and rock composition does have an effect on flavor. And so the folks in Massachusetts say their granite is the best, and the folks here say this, and we say our shale is the best. It's a bit of a marketing ploy, I think, right? A bit of a pride of home, which is great. So I don't, best is in the eye of or the mouth, I guess, the taste buds of the taster. And there's definitely differences, but it all tastes pretty amazing. What actually is really interesting is the temperature seasonally really imparts mostly to the color. So you'll see darker syrups and lighter syrups. So the lighter syrups are generally made in colder conditions than the darker syrups. But we found over time most people prefer darker syrup anyway, which is often what we get in these more kind of erratic springs. Yeah.
But you could have a maple syrup farm in Texas, for example, or in Spain.
No, because you're not getting often the species aren't there, and you're also not getting the sort of thaw from a deeper freeze, right? And so you're not getting quite the volume of sap and quite the same pattern of time. Typically in those warmer climates, the trees don't exist and the sort of climate conditions don't exist. Even in places like the Midwest, you'll have sugar maples or you'll have other maple trees. They might produce, but it's a very short season.
And it's because it's not cold enough during
Yeah.
winter.
Yeah.
And can you explain the thing with thaw, how that affects everything?
From my understanding, it's still a little bit of a mystery why the dynamics all play out that way and how it's evolved. It's quite unique to the Northeast kind of U.S. and Canada when we look at sugar maple in particular. It's both its range, but also that phenomenon. Yeah, I don't entirely know the mechanics of it. You'd have to speak with someone who's really deep in the maple world. Yeah.
Yeah. So, like, even if you only care about maple syrup, you have to stop global warming. Otherwise, we're gonna lose that precious gift that you're giving us.
Definitely, I mean, the range of the sugar maple is already shifting further north, and the biggest thing with that is that the tree seeds need a number of days below freezing in order to germinate, and so already in New York, we have less sugar maple than we did 100 years ago, and we have more red maple. And red maple is also tappable, and it's more adapted to warmer conditions, but the sap content's much lower, and it also probably has a shorter season. So we'll probably be able to keep making some form of maple syrup like 100 years from now, but it probably won't be sugar maple. It'll probably be red and maybe silver and other kind of more southerly species, because we're definitely seeing that change and the stress on the trees. The last 4 winters, only one of them has been quote unquote like a normal winter, like cold and frozen ground. Most of our winters have been much, much more volatile, and the ground has barely frozen, which is a real significant factor, not just for maples, but all plants and also the soil and also like insects and disease, because in colder climates, we really rely on like a cold winter to like reset everything. And so that's going to change a lot in the future. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's say you want to start and have a sap food forest. Let's say that's your goal. You want to grow all kind of varieties, all different kind of saps. Personally, I also love birch saps. It's like so delicious, so healing. And you plant the birches, you plant sugar maples, maybe the special walnut, or maybe even other trees. How long do you have to wait before those trees can become tappable? Birch is probably one of the fastest growing tappable trees, right?
Yeah, I'd say birch and red maple would be a faster growing maple. Silver maple, sycamore is actually one that people can tap. So it's a different species, but it's related to maple. The usual recommendation is like 10 to 12 inches in diameter, and so the question is how long does it take to get there? Like we just harvested some gray birch that were about 15 years old, and they were getting close to that diameter. So. It depends a lot, but it's going to be a bit of a wait,
So you need to have like 10 years, 15 years of patience, because 10 inches or 25 centimeters, it's wider than your head, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
it takes a while. Okay, and if you would do it before, what would happen if you like have a birch tree, you're impatient and you do it after 3 years? Would it die?
It probably wouldn't die. It might stress it more because you're taking a higher proportion of that living cambium out of production. And what happens when you tap a tree is the wood around it actually. What trees do when they get an injury, like if it gets hit or snaps, it'll wall off that and kill that wood. So basically, it becomes a dead part of the tree. But as long as the rest of the tree is still alive, it can keep going. But um, if it's too small, if you kill too much of a section, it might really deplete the tree's ability uh, to survive. But birch is really interesting. We're managing birch in a coppice system, so we're getting lots of shoots. We're trying to grow mushroom logs. We just harvested for mushroom logs, and we'll get another flush of logs in, like, again, 15, 20 years. That's a very short time frame in forestry, right?
Yeah.
Is being able to,
You
but it
have to
takes some
believe in
time.
reincarnation if you're going to food forestry.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's similar to nuts. It's similar to a lot of these things that we have to be thinking about those kind of rotations. And back to like early forestry in Japan, where we look at like shiitake mushrooms, they were managing mostly. They would grow their logs on coppice stands of these trees, and they would rotate on like a 15 or 20-year rotation. And so that's relatively short, actually, in the span of like a forest lifetime. So we balance that patience with some other things that come around a lot quicker.
Yeah. Are you doing stuff that you know that you will never be able to harvest fruits from it, but only your children or grandchildren will?
Yeah, I mean, we'll be able to see some, like even the chestnuts and those kind of things. We'll get some nuts, but I think about a maturity of the system as a whole is not something that we'll probably see in our lifetime by any means. And so I think, and there's always questions about, like, when we're grazing, for instance, when we have sheep in an area, that is doing good ecological work now. It's clearing out a lot of things. It's creating more diversity. But at some point, we want to regenerate that forest. We want to have that next generation of trees, and that means little seedlings. And so, at some point, we'll need to keep the sheep out of there in order to encourage that. And that may be in my lifetime. That may be in the next person who's hopefully taking care of this land. And that's the trick with all of this, is we're constantly needing to think about what's happening in this lifetime, what's this 10 years, what's 20 years from now, and trying to imagine that is quite complicated when we've often been raised in a culture that says, well, let's just think about, the next hour or maybe the next year. Especially in agriculture, everything's on such short time cycles. And so it's certainly something we think about. But there's plenty that we got in year one, we're getting in year 5 and year 15. We have quite a bit of abundance showing up, and it's quite lovely to experience that. Yeah.
Yeah. Eric Toensmeyer, he doesn't live super fast or far from you. He always explains to me, well, Louis, silvopasture, having animals in forested areas or creating more forested pastures is fantastic to do, but it's only like a part of the succession. Once the animals have played their role in regenerating the land, they have to go away. How do you see that? Do you think that in a couple of hundreds of years we go like full regenerative, silvopasture will exist for a couple of decades, maybe even centuries, and then you won't need the animals anymore? Or what's your view on that?
Well, if everything was managed in a regenerative way, if I could imagine that, I think we would have enough space with enough animals raised that we could just think about this as a longer rotation. So rather than just thinking about our 20 acres and the space we're doing, like, we can't just forever graze animals or the same type of animal on them. Right now, it's a good tool, and maybe someday that won't be needed, and that's great. But there's going to be the landscape next door or down the road. I mean, there's so much land that could be regenerated in that way that I don't think we'll run out. And then if we do, there's still going to be spaces that we can manage with pasture as grasslands that have that potential. So I don't see it as necessarily being obsolete. It's just about the rotation. And so when I think about rotation, we rotate our sheep so that they're moving every 1 to 2 days, right? And we're allowing that ecosystem then to regenerate grass so that in another 30 to 45 days, usually they'll come back around and graze again. So it's the same thing on the larger landscape with a forest, except it might be instead of a few days or a few months, we're talking about decades, right? And this is what we see in traditional indigenous land management, where we would see different cultures all around the world clear a piece of land, cultivate it, maybe for a few years, maybe for a few decades, and then move on and let that. And some of our most remarkable ecosystems are the remnants of that kind of activity, right? And so in the long term, that kind of pattern would be lovely to see in our larger landscape, where we have areas resting and new forests and new trees emerging, and maybe we're putting that more intensive impact, somewhere else to good use.
Yeah, it's like the discussion they have, for example, Europe. What was Europe before? Was it one
Right.
giant forest or was it like a mosaic landscape? Well, they found out that it was a mosaic landscape. It was not just one forest. Had like open spaces, closed spaces, everything in between. And it's the in
Right.
betweens, the edges. That's
That's
like
right.
the most important part of the ecosystem because there you have an explosion of life.
Yeah.
And like you say, in an ideal world, when we've regenerated everything, then we can go ahead and say, all right, now this is like full succession. Now let's clear the land. Let's start all over again. And that wouldn't be a problem because you would have, like you say, this perfect cycle, which people have been doing for millennia.
Yeah, the mosaic is the key word there because no forest, I think often we think, well, forest, it starts from bare land and then it grows into this majestic forest, but there's always a tree that falls down, there's always a forest fire that comes through or a flood or something that sort of resets it. And it doesn't usually do it entirely across the forest, but it does it in little patches. And so what we all ultimately want is not to create a uniform landscape around us, but something that has that. Even as young as what we're doing is here on this farm, we still have that where you walk to different parts of the farm. It's very different in terms of the species composition, how tall they are, how dense they are, how open it is, or how shaded it is. And the more we can create that, I think the better, whatever scale we're working on.
Yeah. For our documentary, Eat More Trees, we went and filmed in the Amazon rainforest.
Mm,
And there I learned that they've been doing that for forever, like this
yeah,
this cycle of clearing the land, having it grow back. The Amazon rainforest is a 12,000-year-old food forest, also something amazing. But
yeah,
one of the things that also really amazed me was that in order to regenerate the land and to also keep the water cycle of flowing, you need to plant trees again because now we've been cutting it down at an alarming rate. About 20% is cut down, and if we reach 25%, the Amazon is going to turn into a savanna, which is going to be like a huge tipping point, super dangerous for the rest of the world. But I heard that you can, of course, plant natural forests, but it's impossible because it's already farmland. So the only thing you can do is plant agroforestry. And this agroforestry, it will create the same water cycle as normal trees would do. So you can farm and restore water cycles, restore nature at the same time. So for the Amazon, it's super clear. But if you look at the United States, for example, a lot of forest has been cut down as well. Do you have a view on like how much is the forested percentage of the United States used to be, is now, and ideally would be in the future if you would be the Minister of Forestry or something like that?
well, it depends. The US is tricky because of all the different ecotypes, right? So as we head out west, we don't really see the same ecosystems that we would think of in the east. So I'll just stick to maybe the northeast a bit. New York, Vermont, even Pennsylvania, down the East Coast, right? So what we think of as the eastern woodlands ecosystem. So traditionally very forested, but certainly, like you say, similar to Europe, a mosaic of different habitats, and a lot of that as a result of indigenous land management. There were even things like a eastern woodland bison, so it had large mammals traipsing through the woods that we don't see now.
Oh, wow.
But really, with the onset of colonization, we saw like rapid declines in forest cover. So around me in New York, some areas as low as like 12% forest cover in the late like 1800s, early 1900s kind of time frame. And it stayed pretty low. We're now in New York, like around 65% cover. Some other parts further north where there's less people, maybe as much as 80% forest cover. There is a concern. There's the Cornell Lab of Ornithology is just down the road from us. It's one of the leading sort of centers of the world. They study birds globally. There is a concern of now maybe too much dense forest that doesn't actually provide enough grassland or enough mid-successional sort of mixed like savanna type habitat because the reason that all this forest is growing back is mostly because people have stopped
The
farming.
bison are gone.
The bison are gone for sure, but also people have just stopped farming abandoned farmland. And so again, a lot of that growing back is not the same type of cover that we would think of as like a an old ancient forest, but it is nonetheless mostly covered in like thick woody vegetation, which is not as great. So what I love about agroforestry is it actually is offering that in between habitat often, where we're saying, well, we're not just going to clear land and have an open field, and we're also not just going to plant dense forest. We're going to plant these cropping systems that are somewhere in between that ultimately might move into that more closed canopy forest, but probably again not in our lifetime. So a lot of the open spaces we have here, that's what we're thinking long term. But in the meantime, it's going to be something that's a bit of a mixture of dense trees and open kind of land. And so I think it's hard to say if there's an optimal amount. I think it again is more about that mosaic where we'd have what I would like to see if I could choose is a higher proportion of land in sort of that older, healthier forest. Maybe 30%, 40% would be nice to be in closed canopy forest. And then the other bits evenly distributed between grassland and sort of somewhere in between. But probably what we'll continue to see is like just stuff emerging as people abandon and then also as development and things happen. And what we see is like you have these like great zones of sort of no diversity, and then you have like the wild rural areas where nobody lives. And so there's a real dichotomy. What we need is it a bit more distributed. Right now, it's a bit of like a black and white scenario in terms of like very urbanized and then very rural, and both need a little more of the other, arguably.
Yeah. Yeah, we need more intertwined landscapes, more in-betweens. And it was Dan Barber, the famous chef from your state, New York,
Yeah.
who once told me, together with his farmer, they said, well, you need agroforestry definitely, but you also need annuals. And the most interesting thing is the combination between the two, where the two meet. And that makes like the most resilient food system you can imagine. How do you see the development of agroforestry for row cropping and for livestock going in the future? If you look at the USA, but also Europe or other places in the world, how do you see it evolving? Do you think it will be inevitable with climate change that we turn a lot into agroforestry or a hybrid
Well,
system?
I would love to say it's inevitable. I don't think it's anything but it's definitely not inevitable. It should be the way that we're reorienting towards. Unfortunately, like right now in the US, politically, we're not seeing a lot of enthusiasm for that. And certainly, it all relates to also the scale of farms and the scale of production. So we have medium scale grain farmers around here in New York producing amazing, high quality, heritage type grains that our baker down the road is making into amazing, high quality breads. Like,
Mm.
and that's the kind of system we need, right? And that's very different than the commodity system, which is just producing whatever tons of whatever and putting it into these large production systems, mostly with highly processed food. And that ultimately is not really nourishing for the body. It might.
And producing bread that's like inedible.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, maybe dangerous even. So
Yeah.
so I don't know, I don't the Midwest is a good example. There are folks doing agroforestry in the Midwest. That's such a different context than the Northeast. The biggest thing is the quality of the soil and the type of farming that's happening there is very different. A lot of the landscape in the Northeast is very rolling, like hilly. The soils are not as good. It's quite rocky. It's actually really tough to grow corn and soy here. There's plenty of people that still try. It's not like really the best place to do it. And so the way that grain or annual cereal crops or other vegetables are grown here is very different than when we look at the plains, in the Midwest. And I think what really needs to happen in our region is really supporting more small and mid-scale farms to operate, smaller acreage in these production systems and figure out ways to support the labor to do that, because we also can't mechanize all of this in the same way that you might be able to do in the flat
Or
sort of,
not yet. Yeah.
or not yet. But I also think I've personally found just incredible fulfillment and a need to be outside working with my hands. And I don't see a future where we're very happy if everything's mechanized and computerized. I think that we need to be outside in the sun and interacting with these plants and these systems. And so I would rather support ways that we can get more people onto the land interacting with these things than say, well, what we need to do is scale up and actually just do more with, a GPS tractor, right? That has its place for sure, but not necessarily as the only way to have our food produced.
Instead of going to the fitness, go to the field and pick some nuts.
We joke about
Yeah.
starting a farm gym here because we have plenty of
Yeah.
new work to
We
do.
sh- we should open more farm gyms. They have goat yoga, so why can't we have farm gyms? So you start with a food forest. What's the biggest mistake somebody can make with starting a food forest, in your opinion?
Probably starting with too many species. So I always joke that we have this condition called winter tree catalog syndrome, where you start getting these things in the mail.
I haven't found a treatment for that one yet.
Yeah, you're like, oh, that looks good. That looks good. I circle all the things, right? I put the order together. I have now like hundreds of trees coming. I probably forget that I even ordered them. They show up, and I don't even know where I'm going to plant them. And then
Very
I
relatable.
also have 50 different species, and like it's amazing how much, we call it phenology in ecology, right? It's like how the plant changes over time, what it's doing in response to its environment. When does it leaf out? When does it flower? When does it set seed? When does it go dormant? These parts of the life cycle are so important to learn. And what I see and what I did myself is got too many things and I couldn't pay attention to all the unique patterns of what's going on. And so when we backed off and we said, well, we're really just going to focus on these few things, let's get to know them, and then let's add some more. We had a much greater success because we really got to know what was happening with the elderberries or with the willow and how to manage them and how to fit them into our lifestyle. So I think it's okay initially to go crazy and just like plant a bunch of stuff. We did like what we call test planting. We just got everything that we thought looked cool. We planted it out. And those initial test plantings now, maybe they had 50 species. Now there's like two or three. The elderberries have stayed. The the Nanking cherries, the basswoods. There's certain trees and things we just like, wow, we really love this. We love to watch it. We love to eat it. We love to interact with it. And so you can start big, but then just know that maybe you need to refine that a bit over time and just make sure you are working at a pace where you can really get to know all those pieces of the plant's life cycle.
So you
And
would
then,
say, well, do the plant catalog madness, but just do it on a small portion of your terrain to
yeah,
test which one grows best, also which one you love the most,
yeah.
and then select a couple of them and then scale those up,
Yeah, like
basically.
we planted a bunch of hazelnuts. They weren't happiest on our land. We learned because of the pH and heavy clay, it wasn't the best habitat. And we still have a few and they still produce a few nuts, but it's not what we should scale up, right? And so it's really about, again, it's like the reverse of what I said with the forest. It's like, what does this landscape want to support? And how do I like work with that versus like trying to constantly push against it? And I think it's very easy in your head to imagine something working. And the catalogs do a great job of saying, this is an amazing plant. You should buy it, right? That's their job. But your job is to take those plants and say, do they fit in this landscape? Do they fit with my lifestyle? Do I enjoy working with them? And if I don't, or they don't fit, let's not go there. Let's choose something else. There's plenty to work from. So I think finding that balance is probably the most important thing for people just getting started. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good trick. And what has been your proudest success during all your years?
Well, I think I already mentioned it. It's that I have kids who think it's normal to walk through a landscape that's full of food and medicine and that they can identify plants and they've learned even like wood sorrel, which is a, naturally growing edible plant, they can differentiate that from poison ivy and so they won't eat that, right? And they're comfortable with basic foraging and comfortable in the landscape. I also think that what I'm excited about is when we arrived at this farm, the soil was very compacted, it was very degraded, it was low in organic matter, it was depleted and deficient, and it was sparse. It was a sparse open field, and it was a bunch of, again, thorny brush and actually trash. The previous farmer like threw his trash in the woods. It
Oh,
was just
horrible.
full of stuff. When I think about it now, or I think about it in 20 more years, what we're leaving behind, and what we've always said is Wellspring Forest Farm, we're leaving a forest in our footsteps. That's what we want to walk away from. And so to see that and know it's on that trajectory, and not that we know what it'll look like, we don't know what species will be here necessarily, but that it will be a forest, that's what we're leaving behind for the next people to be here or the next animals or whoever's here, right, to enjoy. That's really the greatest success and sort of
Yeah.
pleasure I get from all of this.
Yeah, if only more people would measure their success by the foraging skills of their kids,
Yes,
that we would live in a totally different world. So that's a good
indeed,
one. And
indeed.
I'll definitely spread that parameter of success with other people.
Yeah,
Imagine if you would be giving a magic wand and you would be able to do anything with that wand on this planet. What would that be?
I get to only choose one.
No, well, you can also like make like 10 magic wands with that one wand.
Right.
So
Oh,
it's up to you.
right. I wish for more wishes. No, I think that in the context of this conversation, I mean, there's a lot of things that need to be healed and repaired, but I think that so fundamental to humanity's challenge right now is a disconnect from nature. And when I think about living in the place that we do, and that we see the stars at night and we taste the fruits of these plants and we can hear more birds than we do cars, I think about a lot of people who unfortunately just don't have access to that space or that peace or those trees or that fruit. And so what I would want to do is, reshape a world where everybody has access to a fruiting bush or to a quiet place by a creek or just some trees, because I really think that trees themselves speak to something much deeper than just the fruit that comes off of them or something. It's something that's really ancient for people. And we've seen this with farmers we work with on some of the projects where we ask them, what do they love about trees and where do trees show up in their childhood? And they just light up. And they often want more trees on their farms. They just don't have time, or they haven't figured out how to make it as productive as some of the other things they're growing. But I think that giving every human access to a space that's full of food and has trees would be remarkable and would really change our relationship to nature. And I think it would change our relationship like to each other and all the other things that are going wrong in the world right now, right? If we had access to those spaces. So I would love to see everyone get that opportunity.
If only our world leaders would hug more trees, right?
Indeed. Yeah, or at least not
Yeah.
stand in the way of us doing it.
Yeah, yeah. I think you probably answered my next question. If you're doing work in the world, it can be sometimes scary or like, yeah, this like very stressful to hear what's going on in the world, the news, legislation that's like killing new forests. How do you deal with emotions during the work you're doing? What's your way of handling those?
Yeah. Well, it's funny because it's certainly, especially in the US, this year has been very challenging and trying, and there's a lot of the future unknowns. It's always refreshing. I mean, I go back to walking in the woods, and the creatures in that space are not experiencing these things, are not perpetuating. They're just living out their instructions. They're being who they are in the space that they are, and I think that that's ultimately one of the greatest teachers and one of the things to fall back on. And so for me, it's often a bit of escaping out, going for a mushroom hike, looking for some wild mushrooms, or taking a swim, or just appreciating those things around me. I have a meditation practice, so that's very important to me, to have some space and not get distracted by all the media and things that want my attention, right? And really connecting with people on this stuff. So, there's this idea when I started permaculture, well, I can just go off and do all this on my own. And certainly that's not true. We need a community in order to thrive. We all have our own passions, our own skill sets. I'm terrible at growing vegetables, actually, despite what people might imagine. But I'm really good at growing mushrooms, and I'm good at forestry and trees. So I like to share those gifts I have and learn from others, and also support others. We love buying vegetables from our neighbors who are amazing at it, right?
Let's barter some tomatoes for some
Yeah.
shiitakes, right?
Yeah, so the more I can tune into that and connect to that as well, and not feel so alone in the things we need to survive and be healthy and thriving, I think whether that's food and food production or making music or doing creative things, I think all those things are really important to maintaining sanity.
Yeah. Well, these are very wise words, Steve, coming from a forest guy to end this podcast. So thank you so much for sharing those. I think there are so many extra things in the work you are doing. Like we've only touched maybe 5% of what you've written in your book, Farming the Woods. And also a call to our listener if you want to delve deeper in one of the topics. Maybe Steve wants to join for another episode later on next year or in a couple of years. Who knows? So thank you so much for this, Steve. Before we end this podcast, are there any last words of wisdom you'd like to share with our listener?
Well, I just want to share to visit wellspringforestfarm.com. That's our website. We also have a project that's a collaborative effort around bringing more trees into farms. And it's just farmingwithtrees.org. So there's some interesting research and work
Love
happening
that.
there. And I just say that I don't have any specific words of wisdom other than to build relationships with trees, with plants, just like you would with another human. Take it slow and take it with some intentionality, and make sure you're giving as much as you're receiving. And I think those will help unravel a whole magical world that we can be a part of, a living diverse, thriving world.
Wow. Well, Steve, Gabriel, thanks for being here. Real honor to have you on the Food Forest podcast. If you want to learn more about him, visit his website. Go to the show notes on foodforestpodcast.com, where you can learn more about all the interesting stuff we talked about. You can also see the links to the different projects, to the different places where you can buy the mushrooms, to learn more about Findhorn, the arid islands, or his videos about mushrooms in logs. See you next week for a new episode. Over and out.